Chapter 11. Harriet is in love again. The next morning, Emma thought about the ball as she walked in the garden at Hartfield. She decided that it had gone well. She had enjoyed dancing with Mr. Knightley, and she was pleased that he had danced with Harriet. Emma had decided that Frank Churchill was not in love with her. Or perhaps he did love her, but only a little. The summer would be a happy and interesting time. Emma turned to walk back into the house and saw two people coming towards her, Harriet and Mr. Frank Churchill. Harriet was crying and holding Mr. Churchill's arm. Emma took them into the house and made Harriet sit down. And then the poor girl fainted. Frank Churchill quickly explained what had happened. Harriet and another pupil from Mrs. Goddard's school had been walking along a quiet little road. They had met a group of gypsies who started asking the girls for money. The other girl was very frightened. She screamed and ran away. But Harriet was too tired after the ball. She did not run. The gypsies were soon all around her. They shouted at her and asked for money. Harriet gave them a coin, but they wanted more, and poor Harriet became very frightened. At that moment, Frank Churchill came along the road and saw everything. He was carrying a stick, and very soon the gypsies were as frightened as Harriet had been. They ran away, and Frank had brought Harriet to Hartfield. Frank Churchill could not stay after Emma had heard the story. He had to return to the Churchills in Richmond. Harriet spent the day at Hartfield with Emma and was soon feeling much better. What an adventure for Harriet Smith! She had been badly frightened and then rescued by handsome Frank Churchill. Emma did not want her father to hear the story, but soon everyone in Highbury, including her father, knew about it. Harriet was not hurt, only frightened. Emma began to think about Harriet and Mr. Frank Churchill. Was it possible that they could love each other? Would they be a good match for each other? A few days later, Harriet returned to Hartfield. She had a little parcel in her hand. "Miss Woodhouse, if you have time, I have something to tell you," Harriet said. "I have been very silly. I want to tell you everything." Emma was very surprised, and she asked Harriet to go on. "I do not care if I meet Mr. Elton or not," Harriet said. "I wanted to tell you that. And I think that Mrs. Elton is very bad-tempered. I do not like her at all. I have been very silly, Miss Woodhouse, but my feelings have changed. I want to show you that I no longer love Mr. Elton. Look." Harriet slowly untied the parcel. Inside the paper there was a little box. Harriet lifted the lid of the box. Emma looked inside it and was surprised. "All I can see is a piece of plaster and the end of an old pencil," Emma said slowly. "What have they to do with Mr. Elton, Harriet?" "Surely you remember, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said. "One day Mr. Elton cut his finger, and I gave him some plaster. There was a little piece of the plaster which he did not use. He held the piece in his hand for a time, and here it is. This was his pencil, but it was too small, and he threw it away. Later on, I picked it up and kept it. Look, Miss Woodhouse, I am going to throw the pencil and the plaster onto the fire. There, she said, throwing them into the flames. That is the end of my love for Mr. Elton. I shall never marry now, Harriet added. The man whom I love will never know my feelings. I admire him so much, but he will never know. I shall never tell him of my love. Tell him? Tell who, Harriet? Emma cried. Who are you talking about? She was becoming tired of this word game. As soon as I saw him coming towards me, I knew, Harriet began. He is a real gentleman. He was so kind to me. I shall never forget it. My feelings have changed so quickly, but they will never change again, Miss Woodhouse, never. However, when Emma asked Harriet the gentleman's name, her friend only shook her head and smiled. She would not answer. I think that I understand, Emma said with a kind smile. But I shall not give you any advice this time. Do what you feel is right, my dear Harriet. You have made a good choice. It was now June. Jane Fairfax was still in Highbury, and she was planning to stay for another 2 months. Mr. Frank Churchill was often at Randalls, and everyone liked the young man. Everyone except Mr. Knightley. Most people in Highbury thought that there would be a match between Frank Churchill and Emma Woodhouse. But Emma herself hoped that Frank was falling in love with Harriet, and she thought that Harriet was in love with Frank Churchill. Mr. Knightley had a different thought. He believed that Frank and Jane were more than friends. Mr. Knightley had seen Frank Churchill looking at Jane Fairfax. He thought that Frank Churchill had a secret. One warm evening, Mr. Knightley was walking with Emma and Harriet in the main street of Highbury. They saw Mr. and Mrs. Weston and Frank Churchill, who had met Miss Bates and Jane. Emma invited all her friends to come to Hartfield for tea with herself and Mr. Woodhouse. My father would be delighted to see you all, Emma said. A meeting of good friends in his own house is just the kind of surprise that he likes. They all agreed to come to Emma's home. As they walked towards the gates of Hartfield, Dr. Perry rode by on his horse. Frank looked surprised. Did you not tell me that Dr. Perry was buying his own carriage? He said to Mrs. Weston. No, I did not, Mrs. Weston said. But you told me so in one of your letters, Frank said. Mrs. Perry told her husband that they should buy more horses and a carriage. Do you not remember? I have never heard of it before. Frank laughed. I must have dreamt it then, he said. I am always dreaming of Highbury when I am away. But why should I dream about Dr. Perry? Oh dear, Miss Bates cried. I think that I can explain. It was not a dream at all, Mr. Churchill. Dr. Perry did plan to buy a carriage in the spring, but it was a secret. Mrs. Perry told my mother, and my mother told us. Do you not remember, Jane? Jane Fairfax was at the back of the group, and did not hear her aunt's question. Oh, well, perhaps I told someone else, Miss Bates went on. I do talk a lot, I know. I must have told someone about the carriage. Mr. Knightley looked at Frank. The young man had heard Miss Bates's words. Now Frank was looking at Jane and trying not to laugh. Jane did not notice that Frank was looking at her. She walked on into the house. The visitors were soon sitting at the large dining table at Hartfield and drinking tea. Frank sat down next to Emma. Frank picked up a little wooden box that was on the table and opened it. The box belonged to Emma's young nephews. Inside it there were letters of the alphabet, which were made of wood. "Let us play a word game with these letters," Frank said to Emma. As he spoke, Frank took a few letters from the box and put them on the table. Then he made a word and pushed the letters across the table towards Jane Fairfax. Jane soon guessed the word, but she pushed the letters away again. Harriet picked them up and tried to make the word with Mr. Knightley's help. "Mistake!" Harriet cried. "The word is mistake." Frank laughed, but Jane blushed and shook her head. Mr. Knightley did not know what to think. Was Frank laughing at Jane and at Emma too? Frank pushed another 5 letters towards Emma and smiled. She quickly made them into a word and then moved the letters about again. "Shall I ask Jane to make this word?" Frank said quietly to Emma. "No, no, you must not," Emma replied. But Frank had already pushed the 5 letters towards Jane. Mr. Knightley saw that the letters made the name Dixon. Jane looked very unhappy. "People's names cannot be used in the game, Mr. Churchill," she said. Then she turned towards Miss Bates and spoke to her quietly. Miss Bates stood up. "Yes, my dear Jane, you are right," she said. "It is time to go." Jane stood up too and put on her shawl. Frank pushed some more letters towards Jane, but she turned away. Mr. Knightley did not see if Frank spoke to her or not. Mr. Knightley stayed on at Hartfield when the others had all gone home. "A strange game was played here tonight," he said to Emma. "I was watching Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill. There is a secret between them, I am sure. I think that they are more than friends." Emma laughed and shook her head. "A match between Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill? No, you are wrong, very wrong, Mr. Knightley," Emma said. "I do not think that Jane likes Frank at all, and I am sure that he does not admire her." Mr. Knightley was not pleased by Emma's words, and he left Hartfield soon afterwards. Chapter 12. Box Hill. It was now the middle of June, and the weather was sunny and hot. Mrs. Elton was making plans for a picnic on Box Hill. Box Hill was the most beautiful place in the neighbourhood. Mrs. Elton and her friends were going to drive there in their carriages. They would take food and drink with them. Mrs. Elton started to make all the arrangements. Emma had never been to Box Hill, and she wanted to go there, but she did not want to go with Mrs. Elton. Mrs. Elton went on with her plans for the picnic, and then one of the horses went lame. The visit to Box Hill could not take place that day. "What shall we do, Knightley?" Mrs. Elton cried. "The weather is good now, but it may not be so good in a few days, and without the horses we can go nowhere today." "You can come to Donwell Abbey," Mr. Knightley said. "You will not need horses and carriages. You can walk from the village to my house." My strawberries are very fine this year. Come to Donwell Abbey and eat them." Mrs. Elton was delighted. "What a good idea, Knightley," she said. "All our friends will be there, of course. I shall arrange everything for you. I arrange parties very well." "You may arrange parties in your own house, Mrs. Elton, but not in mine," Mr. Knightley said. "If I ever marry, my wife will make all the arrangements. Until then, I shall arrange things at Donwell Abbey myself."
"Well, you are a strange man,"
Mrs. Elton said with a laugh.
"But I expect that my ideas will be the same as yours. Everything will be very easy, of course. We can all walk about, eat the strawberries, and sit together for a picnic under the trees."
"I am sorry, but my ideas are different from yours, Mrs. Elton," Mr. Knightley said. "Eat strawberries in the garden if you wish, but my servants will prepare food and we will eat it inside, in the dining room. I want everyone to be cool and comfortable when they visit Donwell Abbey." Mr. Knightley was thinking of Mr. Woodhouse. He wanted the old man to enjoy a day at Donwell Abbey with his friends. If Mr. Woodhouse had to sit outside on the grass and eat a meal, he would be upset. However, he would enjoy a meal while he sat in his good friend's dining room. Everyone accepted Mr. Knightley's invitation to enjoy his delicious strawberries at Donwell Abbey. If the weather was fine on the following day, other horses could be found, and everyone would drive to Box Hill. Emma had not been to Donwell Abbey for a long time. First, she found a comfortable chair for her father in the library. Mr. Knightley had put some interesting books and pictures on a table there. He knew that Mr. Woodhouse would enjoy sitting quietly and looking at them. Then Emma went outside. She walked around the beautiful gardens and looked at the fine old house. Everyone ate strawberries and praised the delicious fruit. But the sun was very hot, and soon everyone went to sit in the cool shade under some trees. They were all happy except for Mrs. Weston. Frank had not arrived, and she was worried about him. He was going to ride his horse to Donwell Abbey. She was worried that his horse had gone lame. Mrs. Elton was talking so loudly to Jane Fairfax that Emma could hear every word.
"It is time for you to make a decision, Miss Fairfax," Mrs. Elton was saying. "It is now the middle of June. You cannot wait any longer. All the best positions for governesses will soon be taken. You must write a letter to my friend, Mrs. Smallridge, tomorrow."
Jane did not answer. She stood up and spoke to Mr. Knightley. "Would you like to take your guests around the Abbey gardens?" she asked with a smile. "Everything is looking so beautiful." Mr. Knightley was happy to do this, and he led the way. His guests followed him and admired the gardens full of beautiful summer flowers. It was now extremely hot. Most people soon went to sit in the cool shade under the trees once again. Beyond the trees, green fields went down to Abbey Mill Farm. A river ran from the hills and down past the farm. It was a beautiful view. Emma was surprised to see that Mr. Knightley was walking with Harriet. He was having a pleasant conversation with her. Very soon it was time for everyone to go into the house and eat the delicious cold food that was ready for them. After the meal, Emma stayed in the house to talk to her father and the rest of the party went out into the gardens again. The heat of the day made Mr. Woodhouse tired, and he fell asleep in his chair. Emma walked into the hall. She looked out of the tall windows at the fine gardens. Suddenly she saw Jane Fairfax hurrying back into the house. The young woman looked hot and tired. "Oh, Miss Woodhouse," Jane said, "I was looking for you. I am going home at once. I cannot find my aunt anywhere. Please will you tell her that I have gone, if you see her?" "Of course I will," Emma said. "But surely you are not going to walk back to Highbury alone? Let me ask Mr. Knightley if you can use his carriage." "Thank you, Miss Woodhouse. Thank you very much. But I do not need a carriage. I walk fast. It will only take me 20 minutes, Jane replied. "But it is hot, and you look tired," Emma said kindly. "I am tired, but only in my mind," Jane replied. "I want to walk, and I need to be alone." And she hurried away. Emma returned to the library, but her father was still asleep. About 15 minutes later, Frank Churchill came into the room. He looked hot and angry.
"I could not come before," Frank said to Emma. "Mrs. Churchill is ill again. I shall have to go back to Richmond almost at once. I only came here because I made a promise. Where is everyone? I suppose that I am too late. People will be going home soon." "I met one of the guests as I came to the house, Miss Fairfax," Frank added. "Why was she walking home now? It is madness to walk in this heat."
Emma saw that Frank was not as cheerful as usual. The heat had made him bad-tempered. At first, the young man refused to eat or drink, but after a time he went to find some cold beer. When he returned some time later, he was no longer bad-tempered, but he did not look happy. "I hope that you found something to eat and drink," Emma said with a smile.
"Yes, thank you, Miss Woodhouse," Frank replied. "I am cooler now and feel much better. But I am not happy. I am not happy at all. My life has become very difficult. I am tired of doing nothing in Richmond. I can never be happy in England. I am sure of that. I think that I shall go overseas for a couple of years." "But you are happier now than when you first arrived at Donwell Abbey," Emma said, smiling. "We are all going to Box Hill tomorrow. It is a beautiful place. You must come with us, Mr. Churchill. Your father and Mrs. Weston have arranged everything." At first, Frank refused, but then he said, "Well, if you wish me to stay in Highbury and go with you to Box Hill tomorrow, Miss Woodhouse, I will."
Next day the weather was fine, and everyone got ready for the visit to Box Hill. Mr. and Mrs. Weston had made all the arrangements, and everything was well planned. Everyone except Mrs. Weston made the 7-mile journey to Box Hill in their carriages. Mrs. Weston was expecting a child, and on this day she felt tired. She agreed to stay at Hartfield with Mr. Woodhouse. The countryside around them was beautiful, but no one seemed happy. The weather was very hot, and the visitors were soon tired. They did not want to walk very far. Mr. and Mrs. Elton walked away by themselves. They did not talk to anyone. Things were a little better when everyone sat down on the grass to eat the picnic. Mr. Weston had brought lots of delicious cold food and drink for everyone. Frank Churchill sat next to Emma and began to pay her a lot of attention. His conversation was lively and interesting. Emma laughed at his words, but she did not really feel happy. Emma was not sure if Frank was happy or not.
"You are the only one who is talking, Mr. Churchill," Emma said at last. "Everyone else is silent. Why is that? What is everyone thinking about?"
Frank suddenly stood up.
"Why is everyone so quiet?" he said loudly. "We have all come here to enjoy ourselves, but no one looks happy. Why not? Ladies and gentlemen, you heard Miss Woodhouse. She wants to know what each of you are thinking."
Some people laughed, but the Eltons looked angry.
"Mr. Churchill is not telling the truth,"
Emma said with a laugh.
"I do not want to know what everyone is thinking. I cannot ask that." "Well then, I have a better idea," Frank said. "There are 8 of us here. This is what you must do. It is Miss Woodhouse's wish. Everyone must say one very clever thing, or 2 things that are quite clever, or 3 things that are very dull." "Oh, that will be easy for me," Miss Bates said happily. 3 dull things. Yes, I shall be able to think of 3 dull things very easily." "Only 3 things, Miss Bates? That might be a problem," Emma said. "You will find it difficult to say only 3 dull things at one time, I am sure." At first, Miss Bates did not understand Emma's words. Then she blushed. "I am not clever like my friend Miss Woodhouse," she said. "I talk too much, and I do not think enough. I am sorry. I shall try to be quiet."
There was silence, and then Mrs. Elton spoke.
"Miss Woodhouse, you will excuse Mr. Elton and myself. We have nothing clever to say to you. We have nothing to say to you at all."
The Eltons both stood up and began to walk away.
"They are a very good match,"
Frank Churchill said to Emma.
"The Eltons knew each other for only a few weeks before they were married. Many men make mistakes when they choose their wives. Mr. Elton was lucky. He chose a very suitable wife for himself."
"Excuse me," Jane Fairfax said quietly. "People may know each other for a long time, but they still make mistakes about each other. They choose the wrong friends. It may be difficult to end a foolish friendship," she went on, "but only very weak people cannot end a friendship that is foolish. It can be done, I know."
"Then I must be a weak person,"
Frank replied.
"I would like someone to choose my wife for me. Would you do that, Miss Woodhouse? I am in no hurry, but my wife must be lively. She must have a beautiful complexion and have hazel eyes. She must be as charming as yourself. I shall return for her in 2 years."
Emma smiled. Frank could be talking about Harriet, she thought.
"Except that he wants a wife with hazel eyes."
Jane's pale face had become red, and she looked upset.
"Let us go for a walk, Ma'am,"
Jane said to her aunt. Miss Bates and Jane Fairfax walked away, and Mr. Knightley followed them. Frank Churchill went on talking and making jokes until even Emma was tired of him. She was very pleased when the servant said that the carriages were ready to leave. Soon, everyone began to walk slowly towards their own carriage. The visit to Box Hill had not been pleasant for anyone. Everyone was glad to go home. Mr. Knightley walked up to Emma and spoke to her quietly. "Emma, you have behaved very badly," he said. "You have been very rude to Miss Bates, and you were rude to her in front of all her friends. I could not believe that you made those remarks." Emma blushed, and she tried to laugh.
"My remarks were not so very bad," she said. "I do not think that Miss Bates understood me."
Yes, she did understand you. Miss Bates understood you very well. But she did not make a remark about your bad behaviour herself. She is too kind.
"Oh, Miss Bates is a good woman," Emma said. "Everyone knows that. But she is silly too. You must agree."
"Perhaps she is silly," Mr. Knightley replied. "Miss Bates is also old and very poor. She needs kindness from you, Emma, not rudeness. You are an important person in Highbury, and you should have behaved better. I am ashamed of you." Mr. Knightley helped Emma into her carriage. He did not say another word. Emma was very unhappy, and she could not speak. She looked up once and held out her hand, but Mr. Knightley had turned away, and the carriage moved on. Emma cried all the way home. Chapter 13. Secrets and Surprises. Early the next morning, Emma went to call on the Bateses. Old Mrs. Bates, who was alone in the small sitting room, smiled when she saw Emma.
"I am afraid that Jane is not very well," Mrs. Bates said. "She has a very bad headache. My daughter is looking after her."
A few minutes later, Miss Bates came into the room. She looked unhappy.
"I hear that Jane is not well," Emma said. "I am sorry." "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, you are so kind," said Miss Bates. "I suppose that you have heard our news. I should be pleased, but I am not. Poor Jane has been with us for such a long time. Mother and I will miss her so much. Jane has been writing letters to the Campbells and Mrs. Dixon. She had told them the news of her, you know, her new position. She will be a governess. But she has been crying, and now she has a bad headache. She really cannot see you." "I am surprised that Miss Fairfax has accepted a position so soon," Emma said. "I thought that she was waiting until Colonel Campbell and the Dixons returned from Ireland. Where is the position, Miss Bates? I hope that it is a good one." "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, you are always so kind," Miss Bates replied. "Jane is going to be a governess for Mrs. Smallridge. Her home is near Bristol. Jane will be looking after 3 little girls." And Mrs. Smallridge is a friend of Mrs. Elton's," Emma said. "Yes, she is. Mrs. Smallridge wanted Jane to go to Bristol 3 weeks ago. At first Jane said that she could not go so soon, Miss Bates replied. We spent yesterday evening at Mrs. Elton's house. Just before tea, we heard that Mr. Frank Churchill had been called back to Richmond. Then after tea, poor dear Jane decided that she would go to Mrs. Smallridge at once. The news was quite a surprise to me. Quite a surprise. Oh, I see that you are looking at the piano, dear Miss Woodhouse. Well, it must stay there until Colonel Campbell comes back to England. It was his gift, or his daughter's, perhaps. I do not know. Poor Jane, she is so upset. Please excuse me, Miss Woodhouse. I must go back to her. I will give Jane your good wishes.
When Emma got back to Hartfield, Mr. Knightley and Harriet were sitting with her father. Mr. Knightley stood up as Emma came into the room. "I am going to London, Emma," he said. "I have come to say goodbye before I go."
Emma has been calling on our dear friend, Miss Bates, Mr. Woodhouse said. She went there after breakfast, as I told you.
Emma looked up at Mr. Knightley and smiled at him. He understood why Emma had gone to the Bateses' house. He was pleased. Emma had made a bad mistake at Box Hill, but today she had behaved well and had shown good manners. Mr. Knightley took Emma's hand, held it, and smiled too. In another minute he had gone. Emma told her father what Jane had decided. Mr. Woodhouse was surprised and upset. He was very fond of Jane Fairfax. Emma and her father talked about the news all evening. But the next day brought even more surprising news. Mrs. Churchill was dead. No one had believed that the selfish old woman was ill. For the first time in 25 years, people found good things to say about her. Even Mr. Weston was sorry, but he was also thinking about his son. Mrs. Churchill's funeral was going to take place in Yorkshire. Emma thought about Frank too. "Frank can make his own decisions about his future life now," she said to herself. "If he wanted to marry Harriet, it would not be a problem now." Then Emma remembered that Jane Fairfax would soon be leaving Highbury. Emma was sorry that they had not been good friends, and she invited Jane to spend a day at Hartfield. But Jane was ill. She was too ill to visit or even to write. She had bad headaches and could not eat. Dr. Perry was very worried about Jane. He said that Jane was too ill to leave Highbury. He wanted her to rest. The doctor told Miss Bates that Jane's health would be in danger if she went to work for Mrs. Smallridge. Emma wrote to Jane again. She offered Jane a ride in the Woodhouses' carriage. Jane sent an answer to Hartfield. She was too ill to go out, and she refused Emma's offer. But later that day, someone saw Jane walking in the fields near Highbury. Then Emma understood that Jane did not want to see her, and she was sorry. About 10 days after Mrs. Churchill's death, Mr. Weston called at Hartfield to see Emma. "Please come to Randalls as soon as you can, Emma," he said. "Mrs. Weston has something very important to tell you." Emma was worried.
"Mr. Weston, why cannot you tell me now?" she asked.
"No, I promised Mrs. Weston that I would not tell you," Mr. Weston replied. "Come back to Randalls with me now, but do not say anything that will worry your father." Emma told Mr. Woodhouse that she was going for a walk, and she hurried out with Mr. Weston.
"Have you heard from Frank?"
Emma asked as they walked away from Hartfield. "Frank was at Randalls this morning, but he has gone again," Mr. Weston replied.
Emma was very surprised, but Mr. Weston said nothing more. They were soon at Randalls. Mr. Weston left Emma with Mrs. Weston, who was looking ill and unhappy. "What is the trouble, my dear friend?" Emma asked her quickly. "Please tell me at once. Has your news anything to do with Mr. Frank Churchill?"
"Yes, it has," Mrs. Weston replied. "Frank spoke to his father about an attachment this morning. Frank is engaged to a young lady. He has promised to marry her."
Emma was silent.
"Oh, Emma," Mrs. Weston cried. "Frank Churchill and Miss Fairfax are engaged to be married. I cannot believe it. They have been engaged for 8 months. They met in Weymouth, and they have been engaged since October. They have kept their engagement a secret from everyone."
Emma did not know what to say. "I cannot believe it either. It is very strange," she said.
"Mr. Weston and I are both very upset," Mrs. Weston went on. "We think that Frank has behaved very badly." She smiled sadly and held Emma's hand.
"I understand why you spoke to me alone here," Emma said quietly. "But do not worry about me. I do not love Mr. Frank Churchill. I used to have feelings for him, but he has been no more than a friend for the last 2 months.
Mrs. Weston looked a little happier. "I am very pleased to hear that, my dear Emma. I am very pleased," she said. "At one time, our dearest wish was that you and Frank would love each other. But he was in love with Jane when he came to Highbury."
"Frank may love Jane, but he has behaved very badly," Emma said. "Frank was not honest with me, and he was not honest with Jane either."
"Jane watched how Frank behaved in Highbury," Mrs. Weston said. "She was sad and upset that their engagement was a secret. They quarrelled. Jane accepted the position with Mrs. Smallridge, and she did not tell Frank. As soon as Frank heard of Jane's plan to be a governess, he told his uncle, Mr. Churchill, about the engagement. Then Frank rode back to Highbury and found that poor Jane was very ill. They both knew that there must be no more secrets. After that, Frank rode on to Randalls and told us everything."
"Frank Churchill is a very lucky man," Emma said with a smile. "Because Jane Fairfax loves Frank Churchill, she did not tell her friends the truth about her relationship with him. Frank asked her not to speak about it, and she has been true to him. Her character is very good, and I wish her every happiness."
Mr. Weston heard these words as he came into the room. He smiled as he held Emma's hand in his own.
"I congratulate you, Mr. Weston,"
Emma said, giving him her best wishes.
"You will soon have a daughter-in-law who is one of the best and one of the most beautiful young ladies in England."
When she was back at Hartfield, Emma began to think about Harriet. Poor Harriet! She must now be told of Frank Churchill's engagement to Jane Fairfax. And I shall have to tell Harriet the news myself, Emma thought. I have been very wrong. Because of me, Harriet believed that she could be Frank Churchill's wife. I gave her hope. I have been very foolish indeed. Harriet came to Hartfield later that day. She ran into the sitting room to speak to Emma. "Have you heard the news, Miss Woodhouse?" she cried. "What news?" Emma asked, but she knew what Harriet was going to say. "The news about Jane Fairfax and Mr. Frank Churchill, of course," Harriet cried. "They are to be married. Did you know that they were in love, Miss Woodhouse? I did not." "I did not know, Harriet. If I had known, I would have told you. I never wanted you to be unhappy," Emma replied. "I am not unhappy," Harriet said with a laugh. "Did you think that I wanted to be Mrs. Frank Churchill? What a strange mistake. The man that I have feelings for is far, far better than Mr. Churchill. This man is a true gentleman in every way." "Harriet," Emma said carefully, "we must understand each other. Are you speaking about Mr. Knightley?" "Of course," Harriet replied. "We have talked about him a lot. I thought that you understood what I was saying." "But, Harriet," said Emma, "the gentleman whom you liked helped you. That is what you said. It was Mr. Frank Churchill who saved you from the gypsies. I thought that you were talking about him." Harriet laughed and shook her head. "Mr. Knightley danced with me at the ball, when I did not have a dancing partner," Harriet said. "You remember that Mr. Elton would not dance with me. Mr. Knightley helped me that evening. He saved me. That was my meaning. Mr. Knightley was very kind to me. He is the kindest man that I know. He is a gentleman in every way. I do hope that you will be happy for me, Miss Woodhouse, and for Mr. Knightley too, of course." "Good God!" cried Emma. "This is a terrible mistake. What can I do?" "You do not have to do anything, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said with a happy smile. "I know that Mr. Knightley is a gentleman of society and that I have no money. But if he does not care about that, why should I? I hope that you will be happy for us both." Emma was silent. Then she spoke very quietly. "Do you think that Mr. Knightley feels the same way about you, Harriet?" Emma asked. "Oh, yes, Miss Woodhouse. I am pleased to say that I do think that," Harriet replied. Emma could not believe it. She tried to understand her own feelings. Why did the news about Harriet and Mr. Knightley make her feel so unhappy? And then at last she knew the truth. Mr. Knightley must marry Emma herself. Emma had to listen to Harriet praising Mr. Knightley and explaining her feelings for him. "He was so kind to me at Donwell Abbey," Harriet said. "He paid a lot of attention to me. He walked with me and no one else. He asked me then if I had feelings for anyone. I did not answer, but I understood him at once." "Perhaps Mr. Knightley was talking about Mr. Martin," Emma said. "Oh, no, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet replied. "Mr. Knightley said nothing about Mr. Martin. You taught me not to care for Mr. Martin. No, Mr. Knightley was talking about himself. I know that he has feelings for me.
I am very happy."
At that moment, Emma and Harriet heard Mr. Woodhouse coming towards them.
"I must go, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said quickly. "I shall tell your father my news some other time."
Emma was very pleased that Harriet had left her alone. A few seconds later she ran quickly upstairs to her own room.
"Oh God, I wish that I had never met Harriet Smith,"
Emma cried. Emma tried to understand her own feelings. She knew that she was very unhappy. She had made herself unhappy. She knew now that she had never loved Mr. Frank Churchill. He had flattered her and made her laugh, but that was all. Mr. Knightley had been Emma's friend all her life. He was a far better gentleman than any other man that she had ever known. All her life Emma had respected Mr. Knightley. Now she knew that she loved him too, but it was too late.
"And I have spoilt Harriet," Emma said to herself. "Harriet is a kind, simple girl. She could have been happy with Robert Martin, but I told her that she could marry a gentleman. I made Harriet think that Mr. Elton was in love with her. I was wrong. I invited Harriet to Hartfield, where she saw Mr. Knightley nearly every day. I praised her and flattered her. Harriet believes that a gentleman like Mr. Knightley could love her because of me. How I wish that Harriet and Mr. Knightley had never met. I shall never be happy again."
Chapter 14. More Than a Friend. Emma knew now that her own happiness depended on Mr. Knightley and his feelings for her. Emma had no hope that Mr. Knightley loved her. She could only hope for his respect. Emma could not think of marriage herself because she could never leave her father. But when she thought of Mr. Knightley marrying Harriet or anyone else, she became very unhappy. Mr. Knightley was Emma's friend, and he had always told her the truth. She could not think of her life without his friendship and advice. Mr. Knightley was still in London, but he would soon be home. Emma would then have to see Mr. Knightley and Harriet together. Until then, she did not wish to see Harriet at all. Emma wrote to her friend and asked her to stay away from Hartfield for a time. Mrs. Weston was the next visitor to Hartfield, and she had more to tell Emma about Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax. For a few hours, Mrs. Weston's interesting story stopped Emma thinking about Harriet and Mr. Knightley. Mrs. Weston had been to see Jane Fairfax, and she had invited Jane out for a drive in the Westons' carriage. At first, Jane had refused, but then she had agreed to go with Mrs. Weston. The two ladies had had a long conversation. "Jane has not had a happy moment since she agreed to the secret engagement. This is what she told me," Mrs. Weston said. "She knew that the secret engagement was wrong, but her love for Frank was the first thing in her mind. She depended on Frank for her future happiness." Jane and Frank had quarrelled about their engagement several times, Mrs. Weston went on. Jane knew that it was wrong to keep it a secret, but Frank refused to agree with her. He knew that the engagement would have made Mrs. Churchill very angry. Frank wanted to be happy, and he was at first. He could not understand Jane's feelings. "But Jane is happy now, Emma," Mrs. Weston went on. "She thanks you for your kindness to her."
"I have not been kind enough," Emma said. I could have been a better friend to Jane Fairfax.
Emma now had the rest of the day to think about her own mistakes. It was July, but the weather was cold and wet. Emma could not go out, and the bad weather made Mr. Woodhouse feel ill. It was an unhappy day at Hartfield. Emma now believed she would never have happiness in the future. Only other people would be happy. When Mrs. Weston's baby was born, she would have less time to spend with Emma. Frank Churchill and Jane would be married, and they would go to live in Yorkshire. Mr. Knightley would be happy with Harriet, and he would have no reason to visit Hartfield every day. Emma would have plenty of time to understand her own feelings and become a better person. The next morning the bad weather continued, but in the afternoon the sun shone. Emma decided to go for a walk. She was in the garden when she saw Mr. Knightley walking towards her. He smiled, and they walked along together. Mr. Knightley said nothing. Emma felt that she had to speak.
"I have some news to tell you," she said. "It will surprise you."
"What is your news?" Mr. Knightley asked.
"The very best kind. News of a wedding,"
Emma replied. "If you are talking about Miss Fairfax and Frank Churchill, I know already," Mr. Knightley said. "Mr. Weston wrote to me this morning and told me everything. The news was not a surprise to me."
"It may not have been a surprise to you, but it was to me,"
Emma said quietly.
"I could not believe it. I have been very silly. I have not understood anything."
Mr. Knightley stopped walking and looked at Emma kindly. "You are sad now," he said. "Frank Churchill has behaved very badly to you, Emma. But he will soon be far away from Highbury. You will be able to forget him one day. I feel sorry for Jane Fairfax. She should have someone better than Frank Churchill."
"Mr. Knightley," Emma replied, "you are wrong about me. I have never loved Frank Churchill. He flattered me and paid a lot of attention to me. But that was to hide his secret love for Jane. I did not understand that. I have been very silly, and I hope that they will both be very happy together."
"I have never liked Frank Churchill, but he is a very lucky man," Mr. Knightley said. "He has behaved very badly, and everyone loves him. He is loved by a beautiful young woman who is both clever and good. He made her unhappy, but she was true to him. His aunt died, and he is no longer dependent on her for his future happiness. He now has money, and he is free. He can marry whoever he wants, and he is still young, only 23. He will have a happy future. Frank Churchill is a very lucky young man."
"You do not sound happy, Mr. Knightley,"
Emma said.
"Do you envy Frank Churchill?"
"There is one thing that makes me envy him," Mr. Knightley said. Emma did not answer. "Perhaps you do not want to know why I envy Frank Churchill," Mr. Knightley went on. "But I must tell you."
"Do not say anything that will make you unhappy,"
Emma cried. "Well then, I shall be silent," Mr. Knightley replied. Emma saw that he was very upset.
"You can speak to me as a friend, Mr. Knightley," Emma said quietly. "Tell me what you want to say."
"Then I will speak, but not just as a friend," Mr. Knightley replied. "My dear Emma, have I any hope of being more than a friend to you?" Emma could not answer. "Your silence does give me hope," Mr. Knightley said. "But my dearest, dearest Emma, please tell me now, at once. You might say no, but I must hear your answer." Emma was too happy to speak. "If I loved you less, I could talk about it more," Mr. Knightley said. "I am not a clever talker like Frank Churchill, but I have always told you the truth, and I am telling you the truth now. It is time for you to tell me what you think, dearest Emma." Then Emma found the right words to say, and she said them. In the next half hour, Emma and Mr. Knightley talked about everything. They talked about mistakes and quarrels and love. When Emma and Mr. Knightley returned to the house together, their happiness was perfect. Mr. Woodhouse was glad to see Mr. Knightley again. He asked him all about his visit to London. Mr. Woodhouse did not know that his good friend was planning to marry his daughter and take her away from him. Emma did not sleep well that night. She was very happy. But there were two people who would not like her news, her father and Harriet. How could Emma tell her father about her engagement? And how could she tell Harriet? Emma and Mr. Knightley could become engaged, but Emma knew that she could never leave her father. While Mr. Woodhouse was alive, she could never marry and leave Hartfield. Harriet Smith was a different problem. In the morning, Emma wrote her young friend a letter. She told Harriet what had happened. A servant took the letter to Mrs. Goddard's school. Emma also wrote a letter to her sister Isabella. Emma asked Isabella to invite Harriet to stay with her. It would be better for Harriet to leave Highbury. If Harriet lived in London for a few weeks, she would forget her love for Mr. Knightley more quickly. Mr. Knightley came to Hartfield for breakfast. He saw that Emma was sad from writing the letters, but before he left, she was happy again. At midday, a parcel arrived from Randalls. Inside this parcel there was a short letter from Mrs. Weston and a very long letter from Frank Churchill to the Westons. Mrs. Weston's note said, "Mr. Weston and I would like you to read Frank's letter. We have forgiven him. We want our friends to understand him and to forgive him too." Emma read Frank's letter quickly. She knew most of the story already from Mrs. Weston, but towards the end of the letter she learnt something new. "I behaved very badly at Box Hill," Frank had written. "I talked to no one but Miss Woodhouse. I wanted to make Jane jealous. I thought that Miss Woodhouse had guessed the truth about Jane and myself, and I thought that she would understand. Jane was cold to me that day because I behaved badly. I made her very unhappy, and I did not talk to her again that day because I left for Richmond. After the visit to Box Hill, Jane wrote me a letter. She told me that she was ending our engagement. Her letter arrived on the day that Mrs. Churchill died. Of course I answered Jane's letter at once, but I had to make many arrangements after Mrs. Churchill's death. I am afraid that my letter to Jane was not sent. A few days later, when Jane had not received a reply from me, she wrote to me again. She returned all my letters. She also asked me to return all the letters that she had written to me. I told my uncle everything, and hurried back to Highbury. Thank God I was not too late. My dearest Jane is now dearer to me than ever. I know that Jane is a much better person than I am. I cannot believe that she loves me, I am a very lucky man. Your loving son, F.C. Weston Churchill. When Mr. Knightley next came to Hartfield, Emma showed him the letter and asked him to read it. "I would rather talk to you, Emma, but I will read it," he said. "What a long letter that young man has written." Mr. Knightley read the letter quickly, and was specially interested in the parts about Emma herself. "So Frank Churchill spent all his time talking to you so that Jane would be jealous," Mr. Knightley said angrily. "He thought that you had guessed his secret, and he thought that you would understand. All he ever thought about was himself. And it was Frank Churchill who sent the piano to Jane Fairfax." "I thought so," said Mr. Knightley. "Only a very thoughtless young man would have sent a gift like that to Highbury." "Well, this last page shows that Mr. Churchill is very fond of Miss Fairfax," Knightley said. "Jane Fairfax is much too good for him, as he says, but he does seem to love her. I agree with him. He is a very lucky young man." Mr. Knightley gave the letter back to Emma. "Let us now talk about something else," he said. "I have had enough of Frank Churchill for one day." Mr. Knightley took Emma's hand and held it in his own. "Emma, I have been thinking about your father," Mr. Knightley said. "I know what you want to tell me. You want to say that our marriage is impossible. It is impossible because it would make your father too unhappy. If you tell him that you want to leave Hartfield, he will never agree. He will not agree to live with us at Donwell Abbey either. So this is my plan. After our marriage, I shall live with you and your father here at Hartfield. What do you say to that, my dearest Emma?" The more Emma thought about this plan, the better she liked it. Her father must soon be told about their engagement, but not just yet. Chapter 15. Future Happiness. Harriet answered Emma's letter politely, but she did not wish to meet her. Isabella had invited Harriet to stay with her family in London for 2 weeks. Harriet accepted the invitation, and soon she travelled to London. Mr. Knightley came to Hartfield every day, and Emma was now very, very happy. Emma went to call on Jane Fairfax, who was still living with her aunt and grandmother. This time, Jane ran down the stairs and greeted Emma warmly. Jane looked very happy and beautiful. Emma was about to speak when she heard Mrs. Elton's voice in the little sitting room. So Emma just smiled and held Jane's hand for a moment. Then both young women walked upstairs. Miss Bates was not at home, so Mrs. Elton was sitting and talking to old Mrs. Bates. Mrs. Elton was looking very cheerful, and Emma soon knew why. Mrs. Elton knew about Jane's secret engagement, and she thought that Emma did not know about it.
"Well, Miss Woodhouse, do you not think that our dear friend Jane is looking much better?"
Mrs. Elton said with a laugh.
"Dr. Perry must be a very fine doctor, but perhaps he has had help from a certain young man. No, I promised that I would not say anything. We must all visit Box Hill again soon, Miss Woodhouse. Some of us were not feeling very happy that afternoon."
Soon after this, Miss Bates returned to the house.
"Oh, my dear Miss Woodhouse, I am delighted that you have come. Yes, Our dear Jane is now so much better. Dr. Perry, such a charming young man. And Mrs. Elton, you are here too, bringing Jane good wishes for... Oh, Mr. Elton will be coming here soon? Miss Bates sounded even more worried and nervous than usual. Mrs. Elton smiled and nodded. Mr. Elton is meeting me here. He is very late, she said. Mr. Knightley must be busy with him at Donwell Abbey. Mr. Elton was meeting him there, you know. When Mr. Elton arrived, he was hot and tired. Knightley was not at Donwell Abbey, he said angrily. I walked all that way, and in the heat, for nothing. Knightley's servants did not know where he was. Knightley does not usually forget meetings of that kind. Emma smiled. She guessed that Mr. Knightley was at Hartfield, waiting to see her. She stood up, and Jane walked downstairs with her. I very much wanted to talk to you, Miss Woodhouse, she said, but with Mrs. Elton there... I might have asked too many questions, Emma said, finishing Jane's sentence. She smiled. You must be tired of answering them. I am happy that you are so interested in me after all that has happened, Jane replied. I should be giving you apologies and reasons for my bad behaviour. I was so cold to you, but I could not explain why. The secret was not only mine, as you know. Say no more, Emma said. Let us forgive each other at once. You will soon be leaving Highbury and all your friends here. I shall stay in Highbury until the Campbells and the Dixons return from Ireland, Jane replied. There will be 3 months of mourning for Mrs. Churchill, and then Frank and I will be married. I am so pleased that you are not leaving Highbury yet, Emma said. I am so pleased that you and Mr. Churchill will be together, and I am pleased that we will be friends. A few days later, Mrs. Weston gave birth to her baby. The Westons named the little girl Anna. All the Westons' friends were delighted. I am sure that little Anna Weston will be as spoilt as you were, Emma, Mr. Knightley said with a laugh. But spoilt children improve as they get older. You were spoilt, and you improved, my dearest Emma. Then he stopped laughing and looked into her beautiful hazel eyes. You have called me Mr. Knightley since you were a child. From today, I should like you to call me by my first name, George. Oh, I cannot do that, replied Emma, smiling. I have always called you Mr. Knightley, and I shall continue to call you Mr. Knightley. I shall call you George just once, in church when we are married. Mr. Knightley showed Emma a letter from his brother John. In his letter, John congratulated them both on their engagement. The family would be coming to Hartfield in August, and Harriet would return to Highbury with them. Emma now knew that she must tell her father about her engagement to Mr. Knightley. She made her plan carefully. First, Emma would tell her father the news, and then Mr. Knightley would come in and speak to Mr. Woodhouse too. At first, when he heard the news, old Mr. Woodhouse was very upset. He could not understand why Emma wanted to get married. You and I are happy, are we not, Emma? He said. Mr. Knightley comes to Hartfield nearly every day. Why must anything change? First Isabella got married, then dear Miss Taylor got married, and now you. This news is very upsetting."
"But Isabella and Miss Taylor both left Hartfield, Papa," Emma said. "Mr. Knightley will be living here with us. He will look after us both." After thinking for several minutes, Mr. Woodhouse agreed to the arrangement. Next, the Westons had to be told the good news. They were surprised, but very happy. Mr. Weston had soon told everyone in Highbury. Everyone in Highbury approved of the match, except for the Eltons. Mr. Elton did not care very much, but Mrs. Elton did not like the news at all. Emma Woodhouse was going to become Mrs. George Knightley. Mrs. Elton was not pleased.
"Poor Knightley,"
Mrs. Elton said to her husband.
"And how clever of Miss Woodhouse to have caught the most important gentleman in Highbury. It is a pity that we can never invite Knightley to the vicarage alone again."
Time passed quickly, and it was nearly August. Mr. Knightley came to Hartfield one day and said, "I have something to tell you, Emma. I do not know if you will think that my news is good or bad."
"You are smiling, so it must be good news," Emma replied. "If you are happy, then I am happy too. Who or what is the news about?"
"Harriet Smith," Mr. Knightley replied. "Harriet Smith is to marry Robert Martin." At first, Emma was so surprised that she could not speak. "You are not happy about it, Emma," Mr. Knightley said.
No, you are wrong,"
Emma replied.
"I am very happy, but I cannot believe that Robert Martin has proposed to Harriet again, and that she has accepted him. Tell me more. How? Where? When did this happen?"
"Robert Martin went to London on business 3 days ago," Mr. Knightley said. "I asked him to take some papers to my brother John." That evening John and his family invited Robert Martin to the theatre, and Harriet Smith was there too. They all had a good time. The next day, John invited Robert to dine with them. After dinner, Robert spoke to Harriet. He proposed to her again, and his proposal was accepted. "I saw Robert this morning," Mr. Knightley went on, "and he was very happy. I am sure that Harriet will soon tell you more." Emma was so happy that she wanted to dance and sing. After 5 unhappy weeks, Harriet had found happiness again. The next day, Mr. Woodhouse and Emma went to Randalls to see the Westons and their new baby. They were sitting with Mrs. Weston when 2 people walked past the window. "It is Frank and Miss Fairfax," Mrs. Weston said. "Frank came here this morning, and Miss Fairfax is spending the day with us too." A few minutes later, Jane, Frank, and Mr. Weston came into the sitting room. Mr. Weston was carrying his baby daughter. Everyone admired the beautiful child. Frank walked over to Emma and sat next to her. "I must thank you, Miss Woodhouse," the young man said quietly. "You wrote kind words about me in your letter to Mrs. Weston. I hope that you have not changed your mind about me."
"No, Mr. Churchill. I am pleased to see you again and to shake your hand," Emma said.
Frank smiled and looked at Jane.
"She is looking well, is she not?"
he said.
"Miss Woodhouse, I am surprised that you did not guess our secret. I nearly told you once. I should have told you. I know that now." I hope that my uncle, Mr. Churchill, will come from Richmond to see Jane soon, Frank said. I feel so far away from her when I cannot be in Highbury. Are you not sorry for me, Miss Woodhouse?
I am very sorry for you, Mr. Churchill, Emma said with a laugh. Frank smiled.
I have to give you and Mr. Knightley my congratulations too, Frank said. Mr. Knightley is a very fine, good gentleman. But do look at Jane, Miss Woodhouse. Is she not beautiful, with her pale skin and dark hair? She is far too good for me.
When Emma left Randalls, she thought about Frank Churchill and Mr. Knightley. Emma knew that Mr. Knightley was a much finer gentleman than Frank Churchill. A few days later, John Knightley brought his family to Highbury, and Harriet was with them. Emma immediately gave Harriet her congratulations, and the pretty girl looked very happy. Soon, Robert Martin was invited to Hartfield too. In the next few weeks, Harriet did not see so much of her dear friend Emma Woodhouse. Harriet was too busy at Abbey Mill Farm planning her wedding. Before the end of September, Robert Martin and Harriet Smith were married. The vicar, Mr. Elton, performed their marriage ceremony in the little church in Highbury. By that time, Jane Fairfax had left Highbury, and she was living in London with the Campbells. Mr. Frank Churchill was in London too. Jane and Frank were going to get married there in November. Mr. Knightley and Emma planned to get married in October, while John Knightley and his family were still in Highbury. But Mr. Woodhouse was very unhappy when he heard the news. October was far too soon. Emma did not want to upset her father. She did not know what to do. Then something happened which made Mr. Woodhouse change his mind. Thieves stole some chickens from Mrs. Weston's poultry house one night. Chickens were stolen from other people's poultry houses on following nights. Mr. Woodhouse was very frightened and upset. The same thieves might break a window at Hartfield, climb inside the house, and steal everything, he said. Then he thought about Mr. Knightley. If Mr. Knightley comes to live at Hartfield, we will all be safe, he said happily. So Mr. Knightley and Emma suggested a day in October for their wedding, and old Mr. Woodhouse was happy to agree. Only a few friends were invited to the quiet wedding, and Mr. Elton performed the ceremony. Mrs. Elton was not there, but she heard all about it from Mr. Elton. He described the wedding ceremony and Miss Woodhouse's dress. Mrs. Elton was very disappointed with her husband's description of the wedding.
Your description makes me believe that the dress was not elegant, and that the ceremony was very dull, she said to her husband.
However, all the true friends of Emma Woodhouse and George Knightley thought differently. They thought that Emma's dress was very elegant. She looked very beautiful, and the ceremony was perfect. And all the friends' good wishes came true. The marriage of Mr. and Mrs. George Knightley was a